Good morning. This seems sort of familiar now. I think this is the second time within a year that I've been here. Uh, uh, Jacob contacted me a little while back. I know he's has been enjoying, he and his family have been enjoying some good time out of state for a little bit, and they're headed back soon. But it is a blessing to again be here this morning. And I guess it was just a few months back that I was here because I remember we were in 1 Samuel. And I asked Jacob, well, what are you teaching? And he said, we're in 1 Samuel. And so all of you, it sounds like you've been in 1 Samuel for a little while. We will see what we can do this morning to not alleviate that, but we'll see how far we do get, because I guess we're nearing the end of 1 Samuel. I'm assuming you're going into 2 Samuel when this is over. I didn't ask Jacob that. But they were one book originally, right? So it would make sense to just continue that narrative on. Let's begin this morning with a word of prayer. Our God in heaven, we are thankful for your Son who died for us and who lives again. God, we are thankful that you give us purpose to be here this morning and purpose to live in glorifying you. Father, we ask that you would please be with Jacob and his family as they travel. We're so thankful for the work that they do here. Father, we're thankful for each and every one here, those who may be tuning in online. God, we are so thankful for the avenues that you give us to be able to study your word together. Be with us this morning as we look at the book of 1 Samuel. Father, we ask that you would please bless us, that it would help us to grow nearer to you. It's in your Son's name that we pray. Amen. It's not fair of me to do this, but I'm going to ask, tell me about 1 Samuel. You've been in it for a while, so I'll give a pop quiz. What's 1 Samuel about? It's about David. What else? Saul. I heard someone whisper Saul. And Samuel. That's right. You have the name 1 Samuel, so you know Samuel, he's kind of a major character for a while, and then it shifts to Saul for a bit, and then it starts to shift to David. In fact, if you look at both books as a whole, you have an emphasis during this transition period from the judges to the kings. And you have the last judge with Samuel, right? You had Eli, who's considered a judge, but he's gone. And now Samuel, of course, you did see him last week, right? Did you go through chapter 28 last week? Or did you get to chapter 28 with the Saul and the witch at Endor? That sounds like a Star Wars thing to me, but it's not. But you have, so you did go through chapter 28, is that correct? Just want to make sure we're all perfect. So we'll briefly touch on that as we go through here. So you did see Samuel one more time here, and you have this several themes going on in 1 and 2 Samuel, but like I said, you've got that transition period as one of the emphases from the time of the judges, where everyone did what was right in their own eyes, and they're still doing that right now, to that time of the united kingdom of Israel. And you have them first united under Saul, or beginning to be, but then you have that Saul kind of beginning on a pretty decent field, although there's some hints that he's not as spiritually minded. If you think about Saul, it's interesting because Saul and Samuel kind of have the same, some of the same characteristics to their names. Samuel is one who was asked for by God and chosen by God, and Saul was one who was asked for but not by God, right? It was by the people. both Samuel and Saul, and this is actually another one of the major themes in the book. It's a book of contrasts. In fact, very quickly, just kind of to get us all together here, 1 Samuel chapter 1. There was a certain man, verse 1, of Ramathaim Zophim of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zeus, an Ephrathite. He had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Notice it opens up with a contrast between Peninnah and Hannah. And as you look through the book, it is a book of contrasts. You see when Samuel comes along, how Samuel is contrasted with Eli, and how Samuel is contrasted with Eli's sons. How Eli is introduced by sitting on a chair, and he chews out Hannah, right? And then his life closes with him falling out of that chair, dying. And then there's this awful name for a child, Ichabod, the glory has departed. And the reason is because of Eli's sons and their faithlessness and Eli's faithlessness. But that's contrasted with Samuel, who we have, for example, in chapter 3 and verse 1, now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli, and the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision. At the beginning of chapter 3, but notice at the end in chapter 3 and verse 19, and Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord. And the Lord appeared again at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. And so you have this buildup of Samuel, then he's gone for a little bit, chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, and then chapter 7, you have Samuel bringing all of the people back together. But notice that how Eli and there was no frequent vision from the Lord. There was no, even though Eli was a judge, there's no frequent vision. There's no frequent word from the Lord. And yet when Samuel comes on the scene, everybody knows, all throughout the land, Dan to Beersheba, everybody knows that Samuel is a prophet. And yet, once you get to Saul, Saul doesn't know who Samuel is. Even though, if you look at it geographically, he lived just a few short miles from where Samuel would have been. And you see this guy, Saul, who has this kind of obscure upbringing, just like Samuel had this obscure upbringing, but they couldn't have been any different spiritually. As you see Saul anointed as king, it doesn't seem to take very long where Saul really shows his true colors. He sacrifices instead of waiting. He changes the interpretation of what he is told to do. And when Saul is rejected in chapter 15, notice verse 22, and Samuel said to Saul, has the Lord his great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and presumption is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. And then chapter 16 is about how David is anointed. Notice, in fact, in chapter 16 and verse 13, Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. And Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit from the Lord tormented him. Notice, again, another contrast. The Spirit of the Lord has left Saul, and he is with David. If you through chapter 16, what's that really popular phrase? God seeks someone who's like what? A man after his own heart. One who is not judged by appearances. Now, when we're introduced to Saul, how is he described to the people? What do they see? He is someone who's head and shoulders above everyone. He is the captain of the football team at Israel High. He is the guy who is going to be king. And yet, when he's even anointed, and here's another contrast, this is the one who the people have chosen, and he's hiding amongst the baggage. And you think of a tall guy. Anyone in here remember Luke Stone? Yeah. Or Paul? I used to have a little Chevy Cavalier. It was, I think they've canceled them now. They're such a small, tiny car that even those of less stature had to scoot that seat all the way back just so you could fit in the thing. And I had Luke in one of those for a little while. And I remember he would get out of the car and everyone would just kind of look like it was someone who got out of a clown car. But just imagine a really tall guy just hunching down, hiding amongst the baggage. And behold, there's your king. And the funny thing is, God had to point out to the people where their king was because they couldn't even do that themselves. Contrasts. Contrasts. And when you look at Samuel and Saul, they couldn't have been any different. When you look at Peninnah and Hannah, they couldn't have been any different. When you look at Saul and David, they couldn't have been any different. As you see David start to rise, you see Saul fall down quick. He is going as far away from God as he possibly can, killing priests, threatening his own family with death, making ridiculous pledges and forcing people to not eat after a battle. You've seen all of these things as you've gone through the text. And yet what's fascinating here, and I've talked about themes a couple of times, the theme of transitioning from the time of the judges to the time of the kings, and all of these contrasts. In fact, after Saul dies, the contrasts don't end there. You have a lot of contrasts in the first several chapters of 2 Samuel with David reigning from Hebron and reigning Judah, and then later on reigning all Israel. And you have those contrasts with Joab, for example, commander of the armies, and you have Abinadab and others who were contrasted during this time. And then near the end of the book, after the events with Bathsheba, you have David contrasted with himself. You have a whole lot of contrast through the book. The other fascinating thing through this book, this other theme that I want to point out, turn back to 1 Samuel 2. 1 Samuel 2 and verses 1 through 10, Hannah's prayer, Hannah's song. My heart exults in the Lord, my horn is exalted in the Lord, my mouth derides my enemies, because I rejoice in your salvation. There is none holy like the Lord, for there is none besides you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who are hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness. For not by might shall a man prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. Now, this wasn't just simply a lullaby that Hannah would sing to Samuel as he grew up. But when you read through this song, this prayer, and then you read through the rest of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, you'll see what is taking place in 1 and 2 Samuel is what's in this prayer. And in fact, you can compare that to the end of 2 Samuel, where David has his great song, his great prayer. And you see a whole lot of connections. But notice there is an emphasis on salvation and deliverance. You have God being the one who kills and brings to life. God being the one who thunders. Notice, the adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. And by the way, just to kind of prove the point, in chapter 7, when 20 years had passed after the ark comes back and no one's touching the thing because of all that had happened previously, Samuel said to the house of Israel in chapter 3, if you are returning to the Lord with all your heart, put away the foreign gods and the Ashtaroth from among you, and direct your heart to the Lord and serve him only. And you have this great call to repentance, this great call to come back to God as the nation. And you have the Philistines seeing these people gather together, so they're going to bring their armies together. Verse 7, now when the Philistines heard that the people of Israel had gathered at Mizpah, the lords of the Philistines went up against Israel. And when the people of Israel heard of it, they were afraid of the Philistines. And the people of Israel said to Samuel, do not cease to cry out to the Lord our God for us, that he may save us from the hand of the Philistines. So Samuel took a nursing lamb and offered it as a whole burnt offering to the Lord. And Samuel cried out to the Lord for Israel, and the Lord answered him. Notice this, as Samuel was offering up the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to attack Israel, but the Lord thundered with a mighty sound that day against the Philistines and threw them into confusion. And they were defeated before Israel. And the men of Israel went out from Mizpah and pursued the Philistines and struck them as far as below Beth-kar. Remember verse 10, the adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. But I want you to notice the last part of verse 10. He will give strength to his king, God's king. God will give strength to the one he chooses as king and exalt the horn of his anointed. The song is about deliverance and God providing and protecting and caring for even when all else seems dire, because he is the only one that can do it. So as you have that theme of contrast from judges transitioning into the kings, that theme of the time period changing and the theme of contrast in looking at the different people and seeing how different they are, seeing how they're responding, and seeing how God is responding. And you have this prayer as being what is going to happen through 1 and 2 Samuel. Now, with those things in mind, look at 1 Samuel 29. And again, you have Saul, who David has spared on a couple of occasions by this point, right? And what's David's basic response, by the way, when he is presented with the prime political opportunity? What's his response? Yeah. Yeah. Saul is God's anointed. Far be it from me to harm the Lord's anointed. Far be it from me. God will deal with him in his time and in his way and how he sees fit. And as you see, I think a fascinating study as you're going through 1st and 2nd Samuel would be to look at all of the Psalms that David wrote while he is fleeing from Saul. Because a lot of the Psalms that David wrote is when he is when he's in dire straits, when it doesn't seem like there's a way for him out, and these pleas for deliverance and these cries for help. And he's answered. So much so that Saul turns out to be the one that's put into his hands, the hands of the one whose heart is after God. And that's why David responds in the way he does every time. I won't touch the Lord's anointed, even though that's exactly what Saul wanted to do, was kill the Lord's anointed. There's another contrast. And so you have Saul, David. Where's David at this point? He's hiding in a cave. He's hiding specifically with the Philistines, right? You have in chapter 26, David has spared Saul again. And then 27 opens up with kind of a disturbing phrase. Then David said in his heart, "Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There's nothing better for me than I should escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand." Now, on the one hand, we can empathize with, or sympathize, whichever word's the right one, with David. He has been continuously harassed and attacked, and when things seem well, then he's harassed and attacked again, and he's done. He's like, I don't want to deal with this anymore. I need to get out of this land and out of this country and go somewhere else. Go to the Philistines. But on the other hand, Hannah's prayer indicates that God is going to deliver, and God is going to protect his anointed, his king. And David in his own life has seen that from lion, from bear, from Goliath, from armies. Remember the number one hit song of the day, Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. So why is it that David here runs to the Philistines? I think the answer is maybe this is just overly simple. He's not perfect. He has fears and weaknesses and doubts and struggles as all of us do. And there's nothing in the text that, as far as I know, that condemns him for this. And God does use it as an opportunity, right? Because David would go out against various people in the land and kill them, taking down those enemies of God over time. In those days, chapter 28 opens, the Philistines gathered their forces for war to fight against Israel. Achish says to David in chapter 28, "Understand that you and your men are to go out with me in the army." And then you have this shift in verse 3, going away from David and focusing in on Saul. Saul knows that this fight's about to happen. Samuel has died. That's kind of just a reminder of what's going on. Remember, Samuel is the one that everyone knows. He's a prophet from God. Samuel is the one where you get the word of the Lord. Samuel is the one who is, in fact, often the prophets are called the horses and chariots in 2 Kings, the horses and chariots of Israel, because their mouth is the mouthpiece of God. God is the one. Some trust in chariots, some trust in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. Samuel's gone. Yes. Did you? Oh, okay. Samuel is gone. All Israel mourned him. And so Saul, he goes to, it's kind of funny how he got rid of all of the mediums and the necromancers and the sorcerers and all of these people, but they knew exactly where one was supposed to be, and they went there to her, and she was just as surprised, right? And she was probably more surprised that this was the one who had killed all of those people and condemned them, that he's the one here now trying to get the very help that he claims to hate. And Samuel's response is, what do you want me to do? If God hasn't spoken to you, what can I say? And chapter 28 ends with food being put before Saul and his servants, and they ate. They rose and they went away that night. And so you're waiting to hear what's going to happen with Saul now. And our author switches back to David, gives us a pause on Saul. The Philistines, chapter 29, had gathered all their forces at Aphek, and the Israelites were encamped by the spring that is in Jezreel, as the lords of the Philistines were passing on by hundreds and by thousands, and David and his men were passing on the rear with Achish. The commanders of the Philistines said, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" And Achish said to the commanders of the Philistines, "Is this not David, the servant of Saul, the king of Israel, who has been with me now for days and years? And since he deserted to me, I have found no fault in him to this day." He didn't know the raids were going on. He did, but he didn't know what they were all about. He thought they were other people. That's from chapter 27. But the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him. And the commanders of the Philistines said to him, send the man back, that he may return to the place of which you have assigned him. He shall not go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he become an adversary to us. How could this fellow reconcile himself to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of the men here? Is not this David of whom they sing to one another in dances? Saul has struck down his 1,000 and David his 10,000s. It's still the number one song, even in the Philistine camp. Then Achish called David and said to him, "As the Lord lives, you have been honest, and to me it seems right that you should march out and in with me in the campaign. For I have found nothing wrong in you from the day of your coming to me to this day. Nevertheless, the lords do not approve of you. So go back now and go peaceably, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines." And David said to Achish, "But what have I done? What have you found in your servant from the day I entered your service until now, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" And Achish answered David and said, "I know that you are as blameless in my sight as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said, he shall not go up with us to the battle. Now, rise early in the morning with the servants of your Lord who came with you, and start early in the morning and depart as soon as you have light." So David set out with his men early in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines, but the Philistines went up to Jezreel. Now, you kind of wonder about the position that David is in, because he's kind of in a sticky situation. He's gone to the Philistines, and he's expected, at least by Achish, he's expected to fight with them against the Lord's anointed. And there, again, you look at the contrast. There's some commanders of the Philistines, some rulers of the Philistines, they don't trust him. They say there's no way he's not going to turn against us in the heat of battle. And then now Achish, who doesn't even know he's killing his own people while he's in his land. He says, no, we can trust him. He's deserted. But David's in a tough spot because if he goes out, does he start killing his own people? Does he turn against the only safety he's been able to find in a long time? And here's something else. In chapter 27, God is silent. Because God's absent from Saul. In fact, the only thing that happens is this, I would say it'd have to be a miraculous event for this to work, where God is giving one more word through his servant Samuel to Saul. And it's that there's no help for him. But in chapter 28, we don't read a whole lot about God. You have Achish saying, you're in my sight like an angel of God. That's about as clear of a reference as we get. The enemies of my Lord the King. Which Lord the King is he talking about? Yeah, it sounds like one of those preacher stories, and I read it in a preacher book, so it probably is. But the story was told of a time where there was a famine, and the lady was praying to God for bread, for food, because she had none. An atheist was walking by down the street, and he heard her praying, and he said, you know what, I'm going to prove this lady wrong. And he goes and he gets bread and puts it in front of her door, and then a little while later he's walking back and he hears her praying, thanking God for the bread, and he pounded on the door and said, that wasn't God that provided this food for you, that was me. See, it wasn't God. And she said, no, it was God, he just used the devil to provide it. Again, it sounds like one of those preacher stories, but it does have a pretty clear point. Because David is in a situation where if he doesn't try to go with, because Achish said, you need to come with me to battle. If David said no, that would have killed that trust. And if David says yes, how is he going to not kill the Lord's anointed and protect him and his men? And it's deliverance by the Philistines in their distrust for him. And I think that's also where you were going with this, is that we see God, but it's in that way that, we have to be careful with that word providence. But that's where, at least we're thankful for the prayer at the beginning of the book, where God is going to deliver. And God is going to protect his anointed. And you have him here protecting his anointed to get him out of that incredibly difficult situation. But we're not done yet. Because David does leave. We're still not back into the battle. That's in the next chapter, in 31. But in chapter 30, now, when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, the Amalekites had made a raid against the Negeb and against Ziklag. they had overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire and taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They killed no one, but carried them off and went their way. And when David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. David's 2 wives also had been taken captive, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and his daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. Here's how to kick a guy when you're down. David doesn't understand exactly what's going on in him being taken out of battle. He still trusts the Lord, but now he's taken out of what he maybe thought was a chance to fight more against the Philistines or whatever it may have been. And he goes back, and now the place where his men's wives and children and everyone had been, they've been taken. And on the one hand, you would think that death may have been a better option for them, because being taken alive meant slavery at best. And everybody is mournful. And they look for someone to blame, and they're ready to stone David. But the Lord's going to protect his anointed. And although David was distressed, verse 6 says, the end of verse 6, but David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. And David said to Abiathar, the priest, the son of Ahimelech, bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought the ephod to David, and David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue after this band? Shall I overtake them? He answered them, pursue, for you shall surely overtake and shall surely rescue. So David set out, and the 600 men who were with him, and they came to the brook Besor, where those who were left behind stayed. But David pursued, he and 400 men. 200 stayed behind, who were too exhausted to cross the brook Besor. They found an Egyptian in the open country and brought him to David. And they gave him bread, and he ate. They gave him water to drink. They gave him a piece of cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. When he had eaten, his spirit revived, for he had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. And David said to him, to whom do you belong, and where are you from? He said, I am a young man of Egypt, servant to an Amalekite, and my master left me behind because I fell sick 3 days ago. We had made a raid against the Negeb of the Cherethites and against that which belongs to Judah and against the Negeb of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire. And David said to him, will you take me down to this band? And he said, swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will take you down to this band. You notice you have David, who strengthens himself in the Lord his God in verse 6. And it seems like verse 7 is the way that he did that. I think that's in an easy way transferable to us. When David was distressed, he sought the Lord. He looked for what God would have him to do. Now, we don't have, the ephod that David has to be able to, get this information and find out exactly, but aren't we supposed to cast all our cares on him? And God does answer David, go after them, I will give them into your hand. And the first step we see is there's an Egyptian who was sick, and he provides information that David needs, where to go to get them. In the rest of the chapter, notice verse 26, for example, when David came to Ziklag, he sent part of the spoil to his friends, the elders of Judah, saying, here's a present for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord. He has been victorious. It was for those in Bethel and Ramoth and Negeb and Jettar and Aror and Siphmoth and Temoa and Rachal and the cities of the Jerahmeelites, in the city of the Kenites, and Hormah, Boration, and Athak, in Hebron, for all the places where David and his men had roamed. He gets his wife back, his wives, everybody comes back. In fact, notice verse 18, David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken. And David rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything that had been taken. David brought back all. God protects his anointed. He delivers David again. And for a guy who seemed to be kicked when he was down, he sure does come back from a phenomenal, what seemed like defeat. Lord willing, next week you'll get to contrast that with chapter 31, where you have another who is called the Lord's anointed, who doesn't have that mercy. Appreciate your attention this morning. It is encouraging to read Samuel, not because of the beautiful themes or because of the amazing history, but because of the promise that God holds so dear and so carefully, so that one day his Son will come. I hope that you've been enjoying studying 1st and 2nd Samuel throughout this time here. I think that was one bell. We'll have another one in just a moment, but we'll call it here unless there's any questions or comments or observations. All right. Yes, sir. So she at this point has been given to another man, and you'll see her, Michal, again in 2 Samuel. And you'll see her get upset with David for rejoicing about the ark being brought back. Good question. But yes, she, after David fled, and remember she said, oh, this man, he threatened to kill me if I didn't let him go and lie to you. And, well, Saul took her back and gave her to someone else. And in fact, David, one of the things that happens in 2 Samuel is David says, you want me to reign? You want this agreement to work? You bring back Michal, bring her back to me. And her husband at that time follows her mourning as she goes back to David. So, yeah, that'll be fun when you get there in a few weeks. But yes, good question. Any others?